Good evening and welcome. To those who've come from outside of the university, welcome to the University of Westminster. My name is David Morris. I'm the Assistant Interfaith Advisor here at the university. And as you may or may not know, this week is Interfaith Week, and so tonight's event is our offering as part of that National Week. This subject that we've settled on has a charge, a certain magnetism to it. And it relates to very powerful feelings that arise from our human urge to connect with each other physically, emotionally and intellectually. I don't know if you've seen the poster for this event, but the lightning bolt was chosen for more than just its eye-catching qualities. There's been growing discussion in the past week of fake news and the social bubbles that we live in. The suggestion is that we're tending towards only seeing or hearing news and opinions that reinforce our existing worldview, increasing our shock and fear when these alternative perspectives rear their heads in the public sphere. Religion and sexuality are generally considered to be matters of the private sphere, but through recent events we can see that they are entangled with and inseparable from politics. With this in mind, it seems appropriate that the Interfaith Advice team have collaborated with the University Department of Politics and International Relations for this event, and we're delighted to have Professor Abdullah in the chairperson's seat tonight, and to have this included under his department's event series, which is titled Challenging Prejudice, Celebrating Diversity, and I believe there'll be some upcoming events that perhaps he can let us know about. Perhaps this evening we can do some of the work of stepping outside of our bubble in the hope that by increasing our mutual understanding across the lines we are told divide us, that we can work together where we can to refuse the worst abuses committed in the halls of power. That's obviously a really grand and lofty way of putting it tonight. When we participate in conversations like this, there are also feelings that can be confusing and scary on a very basic level, an earthy level. At least that's how it is for me.
Thank you, David. And when David had approached me to organize this event, of course, the key question I had was because I'm someone who sees myself as, I'm someone who doesn't have faith, if you talk of faith in terms of organized religious beliefs. I wasn't sure this is something that I was comfortable with at the very beginning or that I had any interest in. But when we had the conversation and we had discussed various issues, we do realize that the issues that are being covered, love, sex and faith, and for some reason I keep saying that I'm going for an event on love, death and faith. I don't know why instead of sex I was talking of death. Maybe it's the depression, or rather it's the feeling all around with Trump and Brexit and Erdogan and Modi and everyone else around, who knows what has influenced me. But broadly speaking, the reason we agreed to collaborate on this is because in the department we are having various things on challenging prejudices, celebrating diversity. Now institutions like to celebrate diversity, but without challenging prejudices. And politically a lot of us want to challenge prejudices, not pay so much attention to how to affirm identity. So this series is part and parcel of trying to affirm ourselves, and specifically we're realizing that in the kind of world we live in today, of course, the world is huge one, England is a small place, but even post-Brexit Britain or in US, of course, in many other parts of the world, we have to affirm ourselves. It's very clear that we can't take it for granted that people would accept each other as equal human beings, right? So in that sense, challenge is ongoing. That's why we have this event. But one prejudice, for instance, a lot of us have, including myself, when we talk of faith and we talk of, let's say, sex or love, we somehow go quiet because somehow they are not connected. Again, I'm talking prejudices that a lot of us share, not the speakers here, but many of us may share. So those are the reasons why we thought we should tackle this subject, where we talk explicitly about the ways in which sex, sexuality, gender, of course, fully to an extent, the issue of love and faith, they go together, they don't go together, right? So the discussion we have today is not so much in debate format, so there's not a debate between different people, but having 4 different perspectives. We may end up with people disagreeing with each other, that's fine. But to keep it healthy in the sense that we also have time for question answer and you have time to come back, we have asked the speakers to speak for around 12 minutes, maximum 15. So I'm very strict with time in general, except when I'm speaking, then I speak for longer, but that's different. We'll have that and then we'll have question answer. We'll start, the order would change slightly, so we'll still have speaking first, but we'll have second and Abdullah third and Sean fourth, right? We'll start with, please.
Thank you. You can clap if you want. So I am an evangelical Christian. and it's an interesting week to be an evangelical Christian in light of all that's happened in the US this week. I wonder what your presuppositions are about evangelicals and their views on a whole range of things, including love, sex, and relationships. In a world that ever increasingly wants us to be defined by our labels, there is a temptation to see yourself as primarily man, woman, gender non-binary, transgender, black, white, single, married, gay, straight, liberal, conservative, leaver, remainer. Increasingly, sexuality seems to be becoming a primary identity. The Christian church, if you read the news headlines, is often characterised by an obsession with sex. Amy Frykholm, in a really interesting book called See Me Naked, Stories of Exile in Evangelical Christianity, writes, "Many of the people I interviewed for this book grew up with the idea that if they made one mistake, they would fall into doom and misery. Sexual mistakes had the most dire consequences. Thus, sexuality became ensconced in fear of being found out, fear of truly being known, fear of failing." I will not pretend that the church has got everything right on the subject of love and sex. Far from it. This is the environment I grew up in, very fearful of sex and constantly trying to calm my carnal desires. For many Christians who were teenagers in the church, our views of sex were very much walked by these words: just say no. Years of seeing sex in that way are indeed very discombobulating if you eventually do get married, like I did nearly a year ago. And then I realised that yes, sex was nice, but it wasn't necessarily worth all of the brain space that I had given it for the 30 years preceding that. And that is where Christians have failed in their presentation of sex and sexuality. But I want to suggest that this is not how it was meant to be. The story of sex in the New Testament is supposed to offer us an alternative view, a better way for our identity and thinking about our worth as people made in the image of God, and our discipleship, our followership of Christ. Vaughan Roberts, who's a rector in Oxford, writes, "From the world's perspective, Christ's call to a wholehearted sacrificial discipleship seems implausibly unattractive for anyone, regardless of their sexuality or particular circumstances. If we are to persevere in the life of discipleship ourselves and persuade anyone else to join us, we must somehow communicate that what is offered is not a set of rules, but a dynamic relationship with a living God." Instead of leading to a sense of shame among Christians, I admit that the church needs to do a much better job in presenting that alternative narrative, one that is radical, life-transforming and life-giving. But in a world that's increasingly hypersexualised and reduces human, particularly female bodies, to commodities, an alternative story speaks of the value and the worth of each human being. We are bombarded with hypersexualised images of females, so much so that most of us don't even notice them. I've heard a statistic that says that women today see more images of outstandingly beautiful women in one day than our grandmothers did in their whole lifetimes. Just this morning I was stood on the platform at Bank Station and could not escape the images of two stunningly beautiful, scantily clad women in a lingerie advert. This is where my particular interest in writing my book, Am I Beautiful?, stemmed from. The idea that, as Germaine Greer writes in The Whole Woman, every woman knows that regardless of all her achievements, she is a failure if she is not beautiful. I remember being really ecstatic when my parents bought me my first Barbie doll because everyone else had them. Barbie, to me, even then, was a symbol of innocence and girlhood. But she was also mysterious, as if her body and her beauty symbolised some knowledge that I was yet to be made aware of. Even at a young age, I seemed to grasp the idea that Barbie was some kind of archetype, a definition of what women should be: beautiful, sexy, glamorous, graceful, blonde, slim, blue-eyed and curvy. I loved Barbie as a child, but now I don't think there's a better man-made perversion of beauty than her. And holding her up as the definition of what is beautiful could be one of the subtle factors contributing to so many young girls' insecurities about their bodies. And then there is the porn industry, which plays into our ideas about our beauty, our value, our worth, our sexuality and our relationships. The internet porn industry generates $13 billion a year in the US alone. That's bigger than American football and basketball and baseball combined. And of course, this is something that has seeped its way into the churches as well. According to a report by Barna Group in the US, 21% of youth pastors and 14% of pastors admit that they currently struggle with using porn. About 12% of youth pastors and 5% nor other pastors say that they are addicted to porn. And the vast majority of these faith leaders who struggle with porn say this has significantly affected their ministry in a negative manner. There are, of course, differences in opinion within the Christian church around ideas around love, sex, and relationships. But in those differences of opinion, we are told in the Bible in Ephesians 4 to be completely humble and gentle, to be patient and bearing with one another in love. Another quote from Vaughan Roberts says this: "Rather than simply accusing others of being unbiblical, we need to examine our own tradition against the standard of God's word. While claiming to resist the idols of hedonism and relativism, have we not too often entered into an unholy alliance with selfism, the modern idol that is worshipped most fervently of all? And in resisting the sexual revolution, have we not so exalted marriage and the nuclear family that we have marginalised or ignored the Bible's vision of the church as God's family, and singleness, whether chosen or not, as a positive vocation? So often the church fails to value people as whole individuals made in the image of God, what we call the Imago Dei, rather than as singles or marrieds or gay or straight or black or white. We are more than just our sexuality. Who are you, really, when all the labels are stripped away? And who am I? Is it all about context? Does the I only exist in relation to another? Isn't it all, in essence, really about community? The Jewish theologian Martin Buber writes about true intimacy. He says that while our culture talks about finding oneself and loving yourself, he argued that it is a nonsense to think of the self in isolation. The I only exists in relation to some other. He talks about I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. The I-it relationship being strictly utilitarian, the exchange of information or a service with another, or any time when you're not bringing your whole self to the situation. The I-thou relationship, writes David Brooks in the New York Times, is personal, direct, dialogical. Nothing is held back. A thou relationship exists when two or more people are totally immersed in their situation, when deep calls to deep, when they are offering up themselves and embracing the other in some total, unself-conscious way, when they are involved in mutual, animated describing. Who am I in the Christian tradition? I am beautiful, of value and worth, because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. But it's not just about me. Who am I in the face of the injustice when I watch others suffering and do nothing? When I am silent when people are reduced to labels and described as swarms living in jungles, or not treating others as I would have them do to me? Who am I when I'm not loving my neighbour? Prejudice and labels and putting people into boxes, whether it is about what they look like or where they're from or what their sexuality is not bringing your whole self to the situation. It's not seeing the Imago Dei in them and not seeing past their labels. In the community of faith that we read about in the Bible in Galatians 3, all the labels are stripped away. Neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ. Sam Albury, who's a same-sex attracted Christian, writes in a book called The Plausibility Problem, Same-Sex Attraction in the Church. He writes this: I think that a Christian should be wary of doing anything that might root his or her identity in their sexuality. We need to be countercultural on this. Our identity is instead to be firmly rooted in Christ. Just say no doesn't cut it anymore. A Christian narrative of love, sex, and relationships needs to present an alternative narrative about our identity, what it is that makes us truly human. Christians are told in John 10, I have come, that Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. In See Me Naked, Amy Frykholm writes this: people often encounter stories about the relationship between spirituality and sexuality through a lens of judgment. They want to know whether a particular action is right or wrong. They use these rules to inflict pain on themselves and other people. In place of judgment, she writes, I would offer the value of discernment. But she also asks us to leave space for wonder when thinking about our sexuality. She says we approach our own sexuality with a potential for the unexpected. What is it I have yet to know about myself? How can I love better? Wonder suggests that our sexuality is not a finished state, but a way that we can still be taught reach and pursued by the holy.
Thank you very much. We have next speaker.
So, good evening. When I was looking at the questions that we were invited to speak about, I thought, wow, this is quite a heady mixture, love, sex, shame, politics. It's an awful lot. So I just wanted to simplify the thing, because I have a simple brain myself. So I'm going to talk from the point of view of what's called the Shambhala teachings. So Shambhala is a sort of spiritual tradition which is more a philosophy or some kind of code of warriorship, you could say, that was spread along the Silk Road. And it draws inspiration from a lot of spiritual traditions, including Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, all kinds of native religions along the Silk Road, which might be theistic or non-theistic. And Shambhala was said to be a kingdom, sometimes it's called Shangri-La, where a huge diversity of people lived together. And it was according to Chinese texts, it was the only non-barbarian kingdom outside of China. So it was held in high regard, and it was apparently a very developed kingdom. More or less in the middle of the Silk Road, and there are archaeological excavations and so on looking for it. But it's said to still exist. But you need to be at a certain, they say, meditative state to be able to see it. But what has survived very clearly is the teachings from that kingdom. And they have a lot to do with how you join spirituality with everyday life, right? So issues around money, sex, work, and so on, they're not seen as separate from spirituality. One of the sources of the teachings came from teachings given by the Buddha. It said the Buddha was invited by the king of Shambhala to give teachings, and the Buddha was giving asceticism as the formula. And the king of Shambhala asked the Buddha not to do that. He said, please, can you give teachings to people who are going to stay in the world, who are not going to cut their hair and go off to a cave or to a monastery, but they're going to be involved in the world, which is what I want to do as a king. I have my kingdom, I have my responsibilities, my family, I have my financial affairs, my concubines, and my music teachers and so on. And I really enjoy sense pleasures. I don't want to give those up. So can you teach a spirituality which combines worldly involvement with spirituality? So that's a sort of tradition I'm interested in and I've been studying. So love is central to that tradition. In a way, love or some... So what is love is quite a tricky question, but love is in a way where we come from, you could say. If you think of, if you look for our origin, you could say we have some kind of genetic origin maybe, but ultimately we started off with two people looking at each other most of the time, right? And there was a very special feeling, and if you wanted to trace our origin, it comes from that, and it's that special feeling that in a way the teachings say we're trying to reconnect with. It's an experience, it's a state of mind, it's a state of being, but we all have it. And sometimes when we meet a very special person, it's triggered in us. It's never given to us, it's always in us. And if we're not in touch with it, then we do suffer. We have a feeling of disconnection, and we wonder whether this is what life is about, whether there is something more, which is more or less the reason why the Buddha left the palace and wanted to explore life. So love is a feeling we want to connect with. If we're disconnected, we're disenchanted. So the Shambhala teachings have a lot to do with how we can relate to our experience so that we can find that very special state of being within ourselves. So there are a lot of teachings on meditation, on how to work with sense perceptions, on how to work with worldly activities as a way of reconnecting with the kingdom of Shambhala in a way, or with that special state of mind, with love itself. So there's a very beautiful poem by Rumi, who lived at one end of the Silk Road, and some of his poetry talks about aspects of the Shambhala teachings. So he talks about love itself, especially in his later writings. A lot of the time we connect love with some kind of object, right? So it becomes purely some kind of sexual fantasy, or it kind of goes wrong. So here we're talking about love itself, the feeling of love itself, which is always in us, right? The world can trigger that very special feeling in us, but it can't give it to us. It's who we are at our core. So love is very important. What is love? It has many faces and many aspects, right? Sometimes it can be a state of well-being, of satisfaction, of contentment, of clarity. It's not purely something that comes about through sexual encounters, but love can also surface when we really appreciate beautiful art or a beautiful scene, or we're struck by a building or by a bird or something like that. It's a feeling, it's a very special feeling. But just like I have aspects, like if you see me from the front, it's me. If you see me from behind, I look totally different, but it's still the same person. So sometimes love can present itself as a feeling of loneliness when we're in love. Sometimes we're extremely lonely. We feel very vulnerable and open and sad. So love has many aspects, and one of those aspects is the experience of empathy or closeness, right? Because we're very genuine when we're in love. Our barriers are down, right? It is a state of vulnerability, but it's a very pleasurable state of vulnerability. So because of that, love and tolerance go together. So if we can discover love in ourselves, then we begin to change the world. It becomes a more accepting, a more relaxed, more spacious place where people are able to feel with each other. So that's the notion of empathy. Pathos is feeling, and M is connection, so compassion. Both in Greek and in Latin there are these words that talk about connectivity, interconnectedness between humans. So the barriers we put up in our minds are what stop us discovering love and what stop love from flowing between us. So a lot of the Shambhala teachings have to do with how we can bring down those barriers, and an awful lot of them are the thoughts we churn. A lot of them are our world views, our projections, our prejudices about who we think we are and what we think others are. It's sort of the mental cogitation and monologues that we engage in an awful lot of the time. So a lot of the teachings have to do with cutting that and creating a gap in which a state of pure awareness can be experienced. A gap where we connect with that very simple, clean state of being present and being open, which is the state of love. So when we connect with that, we also connect with other beings. So it's like Romeo and Juliet. When they fell in love, it didn't matter that they were from different clans and they were fighting each other and they are people who hated each other and so on. It all falls away. So if you can build a society, that's the exciting thing, based on that kind of openness, that is a place of happiness. That is the notion of Shangri-La or Shambhala. So it's very important to think about these things, because we live in incredibly diverse societies, and the only way it's going to work is if the barriers come down towards each other. If we're engaging in trying to convert each other into our way or something like that, this is coming from a totally different point of view, and it only leads to warfare and fighting. You can't have diverse people living together. I just come from Brixton and came out in Oxford Circus. In London, 300 languages are spoken. We're totally different people in some ways. If we're going to fight each other based on that difference, it's over. So the whole notion of Shambhala is through the discovery of love, how can we connect with each other? How can we open with each other and live together and celebrate diversity as richness rather than see it as a problem we need to overcome so we can all be unified and be more or less cyborgs who believe in one thing. So I have problems with belief myself, and my tradition has nothing to do with belief. It's to do with experience and discovering your experience and relating to it. So sex, from that point of view, can be something very powerful and very beneficial because we experience very powerful emotions when we engage in sex, and feelings of very deep appreciation and well-being can come up. We can have, erotic encounters, we can have sexual climaxes and so on, and there's a very big gap that comes about at those times. So the experience of basic goodness or basic well-being, basic love dawns by itself if we can be aware of the importance, the significance of sexuality and emotion in general, right? So sex in itself can be a meditation, can be a way for us to discover our wholesomeness. But there is also a problem if we engage in sex from the point of view of ego or self-gratification, right? So this is the notion of not behaving virtuously or self-centeredness, exploiting sexual relationships to satisfy our desires and not taking care of the other person. Never mind what they think, I know what I want to get out of this. And often, going from one sexual encounter to another, some kind of degraded exploitation of the other. So in situations like that, of course, we're not going to be able to connect with that very special state of mind, because a self-centered mind, an exploitative mind, is not stable. It is yo-yoing between self and other. So that's what we call duality. The mind is always caught up in thoughts between the connection between self and other, right? Rather than exploring the experience of that connection. So that sort of unstable mind cannot relate to any activity, including sex, as a practice, as an opportunity to connect with that state of pure awareness, with that state of openness and empathy and love. So from that point of view, shame can be useful if it helps us reflect on what we're doing, if it helps us question our motivation. Shame can become a problem if we cogitate too much, if it becomes a masochistic exercise where we're punishing ourselves repeatedly. Then it ties up our awareness, so we cannot experience openness, we cannot experience gaps, we can't relate to our basic fundamental goodness, because we're too busy cogitating and thinking, which is always self-centered. Our thoughts are always structured linguistically in terms of self and other. There's this basic duality. So there is always a sort of central character in our thinking process, and it's me. It doesn't matter if it's a miserable me, it's insufficient me, it's a lacking me, or it's a powerful and arrogant me. So that is what is a barrier to connecting with this state of basic goodness that is buried in us, and at the same time overcoming the boundary between us and others, so we're able to feel empathy. It doesn't mean we become all one, but it's connection not through the umbilicus, but through shared feeling, which is really the state of love, or what the state of love brings to us. I think I'm going to stop there. It's just scratching the surface, really, but that's what we can do.
Thank you. Thank you again. And your third speaker is Abdullah.
Thank you. Thank you to the University of Westminster for inviting me, for all of you for attending and lending an attentive ear. I'd kind of like to discuss this topic from maybe a different angle. First, let's discuss religion. Religion is a belief about cause, beginning, and purpose of the universe, of living things, of mankind. And this forms a worldview from which springs a measurement of human actions, which we call morals, and their application or applied form, ethics. Now, prior to Western colonialism around the world and secularism, all religions had applied law systems and were underpinning behind any culture's laws. I believe, for example, Hinduism is actually, its proper name is Hindu Dharma, which means law for Hindus, or the Hindu law. And religion isn't alone in the qualities I described. Materialistic ideologies such as secular liberalism or communism also possess worldviews which generate an almost equally comprehensive set of morals and ethics and laws which reward or permit behavior it deems good and punishes behavior it deems bad. Now, religions differ on what they regard as right and wrong and clash on many points of view. Ideologies also clash with other ideologies, and of course, ideologies clash with religion. And it is in this context that I believe we're having this discussion here today, which is in this society which is dominated by the state ideology of secular liberalism. Religion is sometimes held to account for its incongruence to the creed of liberalism known as individualism. The doctrine of individualism simply states that there should be no higher concern than the human individual, whether society, religion, or God. Individualism holds that all individuals hold complete and absolute sovereignty over themselves and their property. This conceptual utopia envisions human societies akin to a pantheon of gods and goddesses who are all creators of their own purpose and arbiters of their own desires, being independent and autonomous, despite sociology, psychology, anthropology, and biology all pointing to the contrary. Consequently, all morality, according to this worldview, is decided upon the criteria of physical harm and consent. Even harm or shaming is permitted at times, as long as it is consented to, according to this worldview, such as sadomasochism or so-called aesthetic body mutilation, otherwise known as plastic surgery. Of course, secular liberal societies still live with much contradiction. Incest and bigamy are still outlawed, as well as drugs, even if they were all consented to by mature adults, and in the case of incest, even if the two individuals were promised to use protection. Now, while secular liberalism decries social shaming of many individual and consensual choices, adultery and paramour infidelity still remain socially taboo, despite being performed by consenting adults. Marriage was originally a socially recognized commitment regarding reproductive coupling. That carried with it, in days gone by, legal responsibilities and obligations that the two people who enter into it are to give to each other. But this institution from days gone by has now been gutted by individualism to no longer possess any meaning. I mean, because individuals can no longer be held responsible for the desires of other adults. In today's marriage, a husband can abandon his wife, ignore her, and cheat on her without any legal repercussion, and increasingly without any social repercussion. Of course, you could say, well, maybe his wife can divorce him, but that only makes him freer, doesn't punish him or hold him to account for what he did. A contract of marriage today can easily be replaced by two other legal instruments, power of attorney and an inheritance will. So discussions on sex and sexuality, such as the ones we have today, are generally depicted in popular media, Western popular media mostly, as a demonstration of repressiveness of religion versus human sexuality, versus liberation that secularism ostensibly provides. However, perhaps we should look into sociological studies of sexual frustration and loneliness in Western societies, which might shed light on whether that's true or not. Perhaps we should look at the problems of sexual objectification, over-sexualized advertising. There's even complaints of sexualized advertising of children's clothes, which caused some consternation. There was a Channel 4 documentary about it, which was quite shocking. And of course, there is also the problems of peer pressure amongst youths for people to lose their virginity, and also high infidelity rates, which are causing divorces, the leading cause of divorce. But we should also remember that secular liberalism doesn't give people an unrestricted right to seek sexual satisfaction where they will. There are many situations where a person is legally required, and rightfully required, to resist their urges, even if it causes them great pain and suffering. The most common examples are unrequited love. When you fall for someone who simply doesn't return back the feelings, or someone who might use you for sexual gratification, promising a romantic relationship, but then after using you once or twice, you never hear from them again. These things happen, and they're not pleasant, and they cause pain and suffering. The lust equivalent of this is a strong sexual attraction to someone who is sexually appealing, yet disinterested or perhaps unapproachable. And of course, sexual attraction isn't a choice. Being sexually aroused by those capable of inducing it in you is usually not in your control. You don't switch yourself on, other people are the ones who switch you on. Maybe outside your control, you don't like it, but it happens and it triggers automatically. We don't choose it. Yet, I hope I'm right in assuming that we all agree here that people must repress their urges or feelings in these situations. And we also must remember that these situations are not rare. There is also many circumstances which limit and affect people's ability to seek sexual satisfaction. For example, committed monogamy, or someone who is a sexually unattractive person, whether in personality or otherwise, and is unable to find someone. Or maybe a person who lacks lower body sensation due to accident, illness, or birth. These people all have their sexuality affected or are limited in the expressions of their sexuality. And of course, sexuality itself is not as straightforward as many people imagine. Firstly, according to the famous biologist and sexologist Alfred Kinsey in his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, he said that there are not two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats. Not all things are black, nor all things white. It is a fundamental taxonomy that nature rarely deals with discrete categories. Only the human mind invents categories and tries to force facts into pigeonholes. In essence, Kinsey argued that from his studies that it is not possible to group people into categories of homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual, but that humans, while mostly programmed to enjoy sexual stimulation of their genitalia, might not necessarily be born with an understanding of who or what would be desirable to do so. Kinsey says the capacity of an individual to respond erotically to any sort of stimulus, whether it is provided by another person or the same or opposite sex, is basic in the species. Kinsey posited that human sexuality might actually fall upon a scale, that each individual's tastes and desires may change over time, just like your other tastes and desires. This is borne out when we consider the huge range of things that psychologists have found people sexually attracted to, which I will not reiterate here. However, some particular cases include people who find cars and motorcycles sexually attractive, called mechanophilia. No, I didn't just make that up. Agalmatophilia, which is being sexually turned on by mannequins. And in another case, a man was found having sex with literally a street curb, finding them sexually attractive. Now, biological determinists have attempted to find genes that determine the sexual preferences of a person and have been unable to conclusively do so, nor discount environmental and nurture factors that shape a person's personality. Now, there was a study last year by the University of California which found that out of all the monozygotic identical twins they studied, where at least one member had same-sex attraction, only 20% of them both had same-sex attraction. However, genetic determinism has no bearing on this discussion, because observing human beings, you do not choose what desires you have. Whether it was nurture or genes makes no difference. Most of you have desires and tastes you never chose. You were born up. You were born with it. Well, not born with it, rather, but it developed in you at some early age, and it's part of who you are now. But I would like to kind of deal with that discussion of where do urges or desires come from by simply saying that actions cannot be judged to be moral or based upon whether people choose to have a desire for it or not. Desire doesn't make an action moral or immoral. And so it's a red herring to even discuss anything to do with people's desires in this matter. However, humans do have a choice as to whether they can do actions. And that's the most important part that we have to focus on. You can choose to do actions. And it's what the law is based on. Law is not based on punishing you for what you desire, but rather for whether you choose to do an action that goes outside of the law. And from the Islamic concept, and perhaps the Abrahamic conception generally, we believe that sovereignty of the individual actually belongs to God, because God created the individual. The individual didn't create themselves. You didn't even determine your first language. You didn't determine your first name. Most of your personality wasn't determined. And society has mostly shaped a lot of what you think and what you think is good and bad. So you didn't choose a lot of things for yourself. And we believe that God is the creator and decider of individuals. God has sovereignty over individuals. And so morality, according to an Abrahamic lens, is not based on the consent of the individual, but the consent of God, who is the propriety owner of each and every individual. Just because I can drive a rental car and decide where it goes doesn't mean I own the car and I can take it to a demolition derby and do what I want with it. I can't. So the Abrahamic perspective is, in contradistinction to individualism, it has a different measure for morality. But also, I would like to make very clear, Abrahamic religions do not advocate discrimination against people who have any particular attraction or desire. Specifically, bisexual or homosexual or asexual or any sexual. The reason being is because the nomenclature, the labels, which was used to discriminate people by these labels, was actually invented in 1869 and was popularized by Richard von Graf-Ebing in 1886 in his book Sexual Psychopathy, a Clinical Forensic Study. And this was where the terms popularized the heterosexual, the homosexual, the bisexual, and later on the asexual, and so on and so forth. And when you put labels onto people, that is when the discrimination occurred. When people were treated as less than human beings, when they were treated in very horrific ways. Religion, or the Abrahamic religion, do not punish or chastise people for what they feel. And this brings on to the point about love, which I will end with. In Abrahamic religions, you can love whomever you want. Between two men, two women, between women and man and women, love is love. Love is wanting the best for someone, feeling for that someone, making that person to feel really important, and that person making you feel important. This thing is acceptable. Even expressions of love, which you think, which perhaps is associated with different sexualities, in other cultures is not. For example, in Middle East, two men can hold hands and even kiss, and it's not considered to be of any particular sexuality. If you look at even the disciples of Jesus, they kissed him. This is Middle Eastern culture. This is not Victorian England here we're talking about. We shouldn't be confused by this. Other cultures, love can be expressed freely. Poetry can be expressed. Love poetry was expressed between people of the same sex. It wasn't viewed to be taboo. So we mustn't make this mistake. There are no restrictions on love. Abrahamic religion does, however, restrict sexual intercourse, the activity itself, and limits it to marriage between non-familial members of the opposite sex. That is true. But it doesn't mean that people who have a desire counter to that are to be discriminated or hated in any way, shape or form. Because from the Abrahamic perspective, we're all human beings, we don't control our desires, and plus, what you do in the privacy of your own home is between you and God. It's not between you and society to make judgments or to condemn you. So ending on this, I'll simply say that religion is actually here to guide and help people and liberate people, giving humans a higher concept of beauty than just mere physicality and mere lust, and giving people the perception of attraction to virtue and character, which lies within us all and is universal. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Abdullah. And now we have the fourth and final speaker, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you especially to David for inviting me. I'm speaking here tonight from the position of someone who has no investment in any particular religious tradition, although I was brought up in an evangelical Christian home. My parents were missionaries in India, and I was a practicing Christian for about 26, 27 years. But I am no longer, and when I'm asked to tick the box in whatever form, it's usually no religion, which I always have a lot of anxiety about as well. But I am a scholar in a department of religions at SOAS, and I'm particularly interested, or I do a lot of work on the ways in which the category of religion is created and invested in as an identity. And much of my work, therefore, has focused on the history of how the category of religion comes to be adopted as a way to describe certain types of human social behavior and worldviews. And it happens that it's a history that's very tangled up, actually, with the history of Christianity, with secular modernity, and very importantly, with European colonialism. It becomes a descriptor by the European colonialists by which they can devalue the ways in which other people understand their lives and organize their societies. Which is all to say that the concept of religion that seems so obvious to all of us, and the idea that all cultures everywhere have religions in the sense that we've come to understand them, at least in the Western world, is an idea that has a very specific history, is ethnocentrically specific, therefore perhaps isn't an idea that has any universal purchase. It also means that when I use the term religion, it will mean something very, very different to what someone else from a different cultural background, a different region, a different time is going to mean. Which is, again, all to say that I think the same necessarily applies to the three terms that are our focus tonight: faith, love, sex. Are they universal? Do we all mean the same thing when we talk about these words? I'm also very interested in feminist approaches to religion. Like I was born and brought up in a Christian home, I also invested myself very much in feminist theory. Less and less so as I became exposed to post-colonial thought and critical race theory. But I think really the relationship between love, sex, and faith for me comes into a great deal of focus when I imagine or try and understand feminist approaches to it. Feminist and gender theory relationship to religion is often a really conflicted one. And this is because of a widespread assumption that religion is bad for women, it's bad for people who are not heterosexual. Now, feminists, I guess, over the last 20 to 30 years have become quite attuned to differences between women. They weren't very good at this to begin with. They were feminists intended to be representative of white middle-class concerns, and as a consequence underwent a great deal of critique from people who are not white, middle-class, heterosexual, and so on. And this was very necessary. And so feminism has got much better at attending to the importance of the cultural specificity of women's lives, of their choices, of their practices, of their values. So very little feminist analysis now proceeds without first acknowledging and then tracing very intricate socio-cultural intersections that inaugurate and constitute its political itineraries. Which, of course, is a complicated way of saying it's just become much better at recognizing and respecting differences between women that are operating on the basis of race or class or sexuality or disability. With one exception. Religious difference seems to signal a certain intractability in the feminist veneration of intersectionality. It seems to exist beyond the feminist obligation to otherness. Whether you're looking at arguments regarding the ordination of female clergy, the veiling of Muslim women, debates around reproductive rights, just to name some of the most prominent arenas in which the apparently inimical nature of the relationship between religion and feminism is staged, religion or religious allegiance are attributed the status of cause of oppression rather than source of emancipatory insight. Now, implicit in the assumption that equates religion or faith, I guess we could say, but I only really like to use the word faith to talk about Christianity because of its particular genealogy of the genealogy of the term, which is not to say that there aren't other ways of imagining faith, but I have a bit of an awkward relationship with faith. So I would prefer to talk about religion with the caveat that that's also problematic. But this assumption that equates religion with the oppression of women is an uneasiness, I think, that's always haunted feminist thought. And that is, why do women persist in perpetuating and cooperating with traditions and systems that are allegedly detrimental to their well-being? And the same question, I think, is now often posed to LGBTQIA, etc. individuals who also remain committed, hanging on in there with their religious traditions, who often seem to reject their identities. Put differently, we could say, why do so many millions of women remain committed to their religious identities when it would just appear that virtually all religious traditions either deny them coeval status with women, limit their access to authority, circumscribe their opportunities to forge lives as individuals in their own right. The problem is, for feminists, that the dominance of female participation in religion is very well documented. Women are more likely to have a stronger interest in and commitment to religion than men. They attend places of worship in greater numbers and more frequently than men. Their religious allegiance is more likely to remain constant over the course of their lifetime, and this is unaffected by the type of religious tradition to which they're committed. So theories that assert the secularization, at least of Western societies in the aftermath of the post-Enlightenment division of church and state, have to be tempered when they're confronted by the specificity of women's persistent religiosity. Women must be finding something in religion that works for them, that gives them something, that has emancipatory, perhaps, resources, certainly life-affirming sources, giving them a sense of their value and their worth. Feminist anxiety around women's religious allegiance is at the same time inflected by a kind of awkwardness inherent in assuming that if a woman's religious, then they've fallen prey to a kind of form of false consciousness, that they don't really know that they're oppressed. That denies them any agency, which I don't think is a particularly feminist thing to do. It casts them as kind of unknowing, stupid dupes of a superstructure. So it contradicts the conventional feminist insight that female experience is a legitimate and valuable hermeneutic lens. Well, what might the data regarding female participation in religion say, therefore, to what seems to me to be feminism's unspoken, secular, liberal assumptions and allegiances? Well, I think the data taken alone suggests the need for much more complicated, certainly richer feminist accounts of religion that resists the temptation to set up religion and feminism as an inevitably dialectic pairing. The failure by feminism to come to terms with the practice of religion and the importance of religion to women, I think, is at the very least running the risk of repeating a colonial move which makes of religion a kind of form of backward sociality or erroneous thinking in order for it to be able to assert its own progressive character. But feminism in many ways becomes a kind of civilizing mission at that point. How then might feminists both frame and engage with simultaneous clarity and ambivalence that marks religious women's articulation of their lives, of their political values and positioning, their relationship to their sexuality, the choices that they make in their relationships, the love and the bonds that they form with those of their communities and beyond, So much so that we can then become better attuned to the complexity and the entangled nature of of category formation, of naming and labeling practices, political enunciation, and their relationship to material conditions. How are we to think of how categories like religion or the secular get used, but also those subsidiary or perhaps connected categories such as love and faith and sex in the work that we do? And from there, to understand the specificity of terms like love and faith and sex to very specific lived-in realities that are germane to those people. How are we to negotiate the potential conflict or the divided nature of these categories amongst themselves, let alone between them? Well, part of the answer, I think, lies in the need for feminists to attend to the ethnocentric or ethnocentrism of their understanding of religion. That actually a secular liberal framework is an ethnocentric formation, that it may not have any explanatory value beyond that situation, and therefore it is inappropriate, at the very least, if not violent, to take that framework in order to understand the lives of others for whom that framework is not a valuable way to explain the world in which they live. We might then actually be able to see that women's persistent religiosity is a critique of the secular frame of feminism, which may well be because of a consequence of the historical facticity of colonialism, of racism, and their afterlives. Might we not read the feminist preoccupation with religion as a site of oppression, and its seeming ignorance of religion actually as a site of critique, of resistance, of transformation, of emancipation, as precisely embedded in a neo-imperialist politics that of necessity seems to need these others that it can identify as backward, where it doesn't need to make the effort to understand the specificity of their articulations, of their gender, of their relationship to their religion, to their sexuality, and their relationships with each other. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is we need to be very careful not to assume that we know what any of us are actually talking about because we're using the same words, without tracking in intimate detail the genealogy of the lived-in worlds out of which these concepts have come. And I think it's been a really fantastic experience to hear the very different and specific ways in which love, sex, and faith exist in a whole worldview that's kind of in and of it, and holistic in and of itself, that it's not referential necessarily even beyond that. We'll come back to the issue of the possibility of dialogue out of this in a minute. But I found the work of Saba Mahmood very transforming in my attempts to think through these questions of how do I understand what another means when they talk of faith or love or sex or religion. And they organize their societies in ways that seem to me very odd, perhaps, or damaging, or not. No, Saba Mahmood's urge us to urge caution regarding the certainty of those feminist political commitments that proceed from secular valuations of religion when trying to understand the lives of others who don't share those commitments. I cannot make the demand that you share my commitments. That you share my way of thinking about the world and organizing it. Nor can, of course, you do that to me. Mahmood says, and I quote, "We can no longer arrogantly assume that secular forms of life and secularism's progressive formulations necessarily exhaust ways of living meaningfully and richly in this world." And her point echoes that of another post-colonial theorist, Gayatri Spivak, who suggested that, quote, "A concern with women and men who have not written in the same cultural inscription cannot be mobilized in the same way as the investigation of gendering in one's own. These things are all very specific to the histories out of which they come, and that is the context in which they make sense." You're probably wondering why I'm going on and on about feminism and religion and its connection to colonialism when we're here to talk about love and sex and faith, and perhaps some of the conflicts that their relationship can generate. Well, I have to say, I really enjoyed the positive visions of these things. Coming to this, I was kind of like, oh no, it's going to be a bit fraught and upset. And no, actually, these are really wonderful, wholesome, positive images of these relationships that, are wonderful because of their difference to each other. What I'm trying to do, I guess, is call attention to something I think is really important when engaging with these questions of faith. Perhaps some of the basic renderings of doctrines of beliefs, of values of love, practices of sex. All concepts, all traditions have their own history of formation, evolution, articulation, change, and transformation. We can't assume that our concepts and values have the same meanings as those of another's, even if you're using the same words. There's an issue of translation, and sometimes the impossibility of translation, which requires you to move from where you stand to get into what the other says without asking them to put their world into your terms. The history of concepts travel with them. They convey culture and the effect of the really rich investment of a community as it attempts to grapple with the world around it, to organize their relationships to each other in ways that make sense to them, to others beyond their community. So when we hear the terms love and sex and faith, we perhaps assume that these are all universal, that they're shared features of human life. But I do want to question that. I don't actually think that's the case. Or at least that if we do that, then our concepts of love and sex and faith are kind of impoverished and banal. It's human diversity that gives these things meaning, because human diversity is context specific. So I want to suggest that we don't all mean the same thing when we use these terms. And this is partly why I think in perhaps some of the secular critiques of religious positionings on things, the kind of intimate history that brings a religious group to think the way that they think is very poorly understood. Whose conception of love prevails or is allowed to prevail in public discourse, at least in secular societies? We could even ask the question, as is being asked in a major religions conference at the moment, whose theme is revolutionary love, whether there's something exclusively Christian about the way in which the discourse of love is being framed all the time. Are there not surely other ways to imagine it? Are there analogues in other traditions or entirely different ways of imagining these things? Is love a universal human value, or is it very context specific? So I would say that in thinking through all of these issues, what I would want to do is to learn the language of the other. I would say that coming from SOAS, where we love learning the languages of the other, coming out, of course, of a colonial history, which we're very ashamed of. But when you start to dream in another language, I think you really start to see the world very, very differently. I grew up in India, and I often use this example to kind of explain the really different conceptual apparatus that comes with it. When I say in English, I learn English, I becomes the subject of that sentence. It's at the center, it drives the action forward. In Hindi, I say, mujhe Hindi aati hai, meaning Hindi comes to me, literally, is what it means. And there, the language is the kind of driving force. It's a totally, totally different way of thinking. So when you inhabit the language, you really learn you take on really a different way of thinking that is fundamentally transformative. One thing I would also say, in kind of perhaps defending the feminist principles with which were so important to me, is that we also do need to understand that faiths are internally heterogeneous, that all faith systems are often very rich traditions of contestation and debate. Not everyone within a religious tradition thinks the same thing. A public face of a tradition might seem to be rigidly orthodox, but this obscures the degree of difference and debate and negotiation that goes on with religious communities. And some religious communities have quite abhorrent views about others. But there'll always be voices in those traditions that are complete opposites. So that would, I guess, be my plea, is that we learn the language of the other, when it comes to issues of sex and love and faith, but also that we recognize that religions themselves are internally differentiated. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, I thought I would have asked you the first question, why were you anxious? When you said when you came, you thought it would be fraught and everything. So I was going to ask you, why did you think that? We'll come back to it. But the reason I said is because, again, it goes back to what we expect when we think of people discussing love, sex and faith, right? But we'll come to that. In fact, I'll start with audience question answer because we have to finish by 8:25. I have my own questions in case you don't have, so but I'll let you have let you ask the first question. Who'd like to start? And we can take a couple of questions together. It could be to one person or the entire panel, or 2 or 3 of them. We'll take 2, 3 together, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond briefly.
Can I just add something just in advance? That there is audio recording going on. There's visual recording going on of the panel, not of the audience. If you want to ask a question but you wouldn't want that to be recorded or used in any way, then please tell us afterwards and we'll ensure that that isn't shared in any way that you wouldn't wish. So I hope that doesn't impede you wishing to ask the question.
So, thanks. Who would like to start? Please.
I was going to ask, I've got a big question and a little question, so I'll ask the big one first and then drop the little one at the end. So at the end of your speech, which was really good, by the way, I really enjoyed it, when you were talking about maybe not defining our identity as a sexuality, I come from a Catholic background. For many people, their sexuality is rendered as their defining attribute by the church, by homophobic politics, or by their parents. And so to suggest rooting an identity in Christ when one is gay or gender non-conforming can be asking someone to root their identity in the very thing that caused their suffering in the first place. So I was just wondering, how much weight do you think the effort for reconciliation should be placed on the church to internally look at its oppressive practices, rather than asking people who have in many ways been forced to make their sexuality their defining identity because it's their point of exclusion? To what extent do you think we should expect the church to do the legwork rather than asking people to remove or change their identities? And the little question was your thought on feminist porn, like directors like Anna Aris who can curate their own porn completely female-led and things like that.
Okay.
Can you take a note? We can take a couple of questions, then come back.
Yeah.
But anyone else next? No, go ahead then. It's okay.
Very, very good question. And I personally, although I don't represent the whole of the church, it breaks my heart when I see, discrimination, prejudice against any human beings, regardless of sexuality, race, gender, any of those things. And what I would say in terms of asking people to root their identity in Christ, I genuinely don't think that Christ is the oppressor. I think that humans are the oppressors. So I think humans within the church have done a lot of things wrong, and I think there's absolutely a lot of legwork and time to be made up in terms of reconciliation and walking alongside people, not being prejudiced. For some parts of the church, that will be more difficult. So I think that there are, obviously, evangelical tradition would hold to a biblical interpretation of marriage. So, but within those areas of the church, there are conversations going on today, this year, the past few years, around how to be welcoming and not judgmental while holding to those very deeply held beliefs. I think as well, I think the closest, the way that I can get into a person's head who is suffering, has suffered from prejudice because of what's happened in the church would be race for me. So it would be the equivalent of asking me to kind of forget my race and kind of make steps towards the church when the church has obviously been over the years the perpetrator of that oppression. So I can understand what that might sound like, but I think the Christian tradition does ask us to not have any labels, so that Galatians passage about neither male nor female, etc., that is what Jesus calls us to. So I think, in short, it is difficult. I think the church has a lot to do in terms of reaching out, rather than asking people to come in and forget all that they have gone through before. But my issue around identity and sexuality was for all sexualities rather than homosexuality. On the female porn, I don't know what to say. Increasingly there are more women who are directing, and I think that what the church has done traditionally is, from evangelical circles, is assume that porn is only something that men watch, that men are kind of afflicted with this addiction, but actually increasingly it is a female issue as well. And I think there is a sense within patriarchal Christian traditions that women are pure, and they would never have such thoughts. And so that's something that's increasingly being talked about within evangelical Christian circles. But yeah, that's probably what I can say.
You want to add to this? Okay.
Yeah, I'll probably echo what my colleague has mentioned about labels, and that in Abrahamic religions, obviously, labels which a person couldn't choose are not really important. It's what you can choose which defines you. So your belief, whether you're just, whether you're trustworthy, your level of piety, that is what you're defined by, rather than things that you have no choice in. But I also like to kind of, I suppose, disagree with identity politics, or 20th century identity politics, and perhaps the American milieu of which it arose out of, where people are bracketed into separate communities based on particular attributes that they have, which I think is quite literally discrimination. And in some ways, it can be absurd if you think about it. If I was to say we need to focus on the community of people who have brown eyes, what are their rights, what are their interests, what about the people who have blue eyes? You'd think that sounds silly, right? Why would you do that? Aren't they human? Don't they have the same interests everybody else has? Well, it's the same thing with everybody else. And in some ways, it causes this friction because people start to relate to each other based on identity or attributes they have which they didn't choose, and now they're now defined by those labels. As I said, we can all thank Richard von Graft-Ebing for popularizing sexual taxonomy and making it an identity that people are going to now be defined by, and somehow a culture. And I don't think there's such a thing as heterosexual culture or bisexual culture or asexual culture. And I think that, in essence, people should only be dealt with as they come, as what they believe, what they do, how they act, not rather these attributes about themselves, which they say, I'm going to assume the cloak of or mantle of a particular community that I didn't really choose to get into, but it will now define me and now define my interests. I think that's a bit more divisive, and I would go for a more universalist humanitarian approach, whereby we just take people as they are and what they profess.
Okay. Any question or can I? Okay. Oh, you okay? No, David, I have to give preference to. Sure.
I just wanted to follow up from this strand, and just so I understand what you're talking about in the way that you're viewing those identity categories as a kind of form of discrimination. And I just wondered what your response would be. You said about blue eyes, green eyes, attributes that we're not responsible for. I wondered how gender fits into that for you. Does it fall within a similar kind of imposed categorization, or is it somehow separate?
I'd say that you shouldn't have such a thing as the male community and the female community, which are meant to have separate interests. I think that also no one would actually agree with that per se. There are perhaps militant strands of feminism that might look at the world through that. As communists view the world as proletariat and bourgeois, they view the world through that kind of lens as well, in a similar manner. But I would think that it'd be silly, because there's no such thing as the male community and the female community. It's all one community. Our families are mixed. They're not separate races or species or anything. We're all from each other. So I would say that while it would be absurd to separate or differentiate people into identity communities based on gender, however, whether based on obviously the Abrahamic religions have an idea about roles within the family. And that's more related to the realities of, I suppose, human sexual dimorphism. A man cannot give birth. And that's just one of those things that you can't really change for the foreseeable future. I don't know what science is coming up with. And those situations have to be accounted for. And even in Western societies, there are laws which obviously allow some form of positive discrimination towards these issues that women obviously might face, which men don't necessarily face. It depends from country to country. So some countries it might be that women are granted maternity leave, whereas men can't apply for it. Some countries are trying to equalize it, saying no, men can also apply for maternity leave. But there are other things, such as who gets to choose as to abortions, for example. Is it both the father and the mother? Is it only the mother? Obviously, in most Western countries, it's only the mother, even though the father has obviously his genetic materials there. So the laws obviously allow these things this kind of discrimination to occur because of biological realities. So in essence, that would be the only caveat I would put, is that Abrahamic religions tend to have family roles, not imposed or forced and so on, but roles which are encouraged and which are expected. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, but that would be a caveat to that.
In fact, few comments and questions for all four of you, so I'll take over and you can think of more questions in the meantime. In terms of, again, thank you for all the different ideas, and of course there are certain common themes I saw, and of course differences also slightly, and certain silences which I felt was there. So for instance, two of you specifically talked about labels, that we need to avoid labels, and labels are not very helpful, even including in terms of communities. We say, let's say, gay community, heterosexual community, male community, female community. Of course, there's male community there. Look at most of the militaries, they are male community oriented, but that's different. Labels. Now, the thing is, don't face, and this is a question for, in a sense, all four or two of you could answer. When we say, okay, labels should not be there, but almost all faiths, let's say, when I say faith, I mean organized religion, they indulge in labels. So, for instance, are you in or out? Are you Christian or not a Christian? Are you Muslim or not a Muslim? Are you Buddhist or not a Muslim? So I think all faith groups start with labeling. So when we say we should not be labeling, are we not giving a very positive view of the faith and ignoring the ways in which faiths have labeled people, killed people along the label, even discriminated against them? So to what extent, I think if you could reflect more on label. And then second is about power. I mean, and I think Sean pointed out to an extent about power, and that exists within different religion, different interpretation of religion. But could you also say more about the ways in which power plays an important role in how religion gets interpreted? Who decides what forms of love are legitimate and not legitimate, and what forms of desire are acceptable and not acceptable? So the role of power. And it seems a lot of you, not all, but talked of secular liberalism, though we're not talking of it as explicitly, but it came up again and again. And idea of that we are dealing with lived-in world and ideas, and that I think is a very important part, that we are dealing with real human beings. I mean, people who breathe in one sense, right? And when we talk of faith and we talk of ideas, are we talking of lived human beings, embodied human beings, or are we talking of ideas which are there in text? So these are kind of questions I had. But violence, none of you almost mentioned violence. Maybe I didn't pay attention. Violence, because I did feel that when we're dealing with the world we live in today, including faith, not only faith, of course, secularism and everything is connected, we are dealing with a largely violent world. Faith, along with secular ideas and liberal ideas, have been used to justify violence against the others and used to justify dehumanization. Where in your analysis does the practice of dehumanization take place? I understand with liberalism and secularism it's very obvious through colonialism. But what about faith? Have faith been successful in preventing dehumanization? So these are a few of the ideas I had. So who would like Sean and then me? Yeah,
well, so many great questions. So many great questions. But my question back to you would be, why does religion get singled out as a separate thing? Whether you're talking about labels, how else would the world work if we don't have labels? It's called language, right? We name things in order to understand them, relate to them, connect them to other things, and so on, which bears on both a culture's conceptuality, but also, of course, the materiality, so the lived-in realities, right? So language helps us to make distinctions between things which are hugely valuable things to do, but of course they could always carry with them the potential towards violence, to hatred, discrimination, and so on. I also would want to really resist this sense that perhaps religions are uniquely violent. I think that you're already separating religion out from politics, from from law, and so on and so forth. Yeah, for most of the world's population, that distinction isn't made in the first place. So I think it's helpful to kind of point to something as religious violence as opposed to secular liberal violence or what other kinds of violence, sexual violence, or whatever. You know, there's violence, right? And I don't think that naming it as having a kind of typology of violence is particularly helpful. Where you have labeling, you have a naming and an organizing of the world, which is useful, but it carries the risk of violence. And so I do think that, you know, religions I know we've presented a very positive perspective on religion. I think that's an important thing to do in a time of terror like this. I think, you know, it's a politically valuable thing to do, and to resist this tendency to always make religions the problem or the elephant in the room. But this is not to say that there aren't ideologies, as there are in every single aspect of life, that are discriminatory, that promote violence, that are damaging to all sorts of people that are part of that community or put outside that community and so on. And of course we need to be honest about that. There are some really violent, disgusting, abhorrent, from my perspective, views about gay people in most of the religions that I can think of. Treatment of women is historically disgusting. And yet, there is an internal logic to the ways in which people organize their societies, which I think we've had well presented here today, that is important and valuable and positive. And I always end up saying this everywhere I speak. It's always more complicated than it's either good religion or bad religion. It's human life, and so it's always going to have all of this complication. I'm not going to single out religion as uniquely bad or uniquely great. It's human.
Yeah, I agree with Sean. My question would have been to you around. Actually, it is human nature to create barriers or put a ring around who is like me, who can I trust, am I okay with these people, or am I against them? So I'm from Nigeria, and I say Nigeria, and then I'm from the Igbo tribe of Nigeria, and I'm not even from the Igbo tribe. My dad is from Abia State, and my mum's from Enugu, so therefore they are seen as enemies within even that state. And then you look at West Africa, and then Africa, the West versus Africa, Cambridge v Oxford, black v white, woman, man. Like, it just goes on and on and on. So we are, as humans, continually trying to feel safe, or knowing, wanting a sense of belonging, and knowing whether we're okay. My other thing, when you were saying religions have this sense of, you know, who's in and out, I think that displays a kind of, as Sean was saying earlier, a misunderstanding of, particularly, for example, the Christian faith. So when I talk about my Christian faith, I'm not saying I'm in and you are out. I would describe myself as having a living faith in something. Some people choose not to. So therefore, they're not Christian, but that's their decision. It's not me excluding someone because I'm judging them.
Thank you.
Well, did you want me to?
If you want to say anything, if not, it's okay.
Well, I mean, the question of violence, I think we have to face the realities. We're not living in a world where religion is as powerful as it was even 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The dominant culture now is materialism and consumerism. Yes, it's destroying our planet, and it's replaced religion. Just look at Asia. I mean, the way Far Eastern cultures have become so materialistic, so driven, whereas before there was some kind of religion, there was Buddhism, Taoism and so on, and it's become very powerful. You cannot ignore that. Materialism is inherently violent because it encourages the view that happiness and well-being is something you can buy, and it is external to you, and human beings are inherently deficient and lacking because they need to find this happiness through purchase, through buying, which immediately means you have to possess the resources for producing. You have to have power to possess that. So you will kill people for oil because oil will enable you to gain happiness because you can produce and consume more. So what appears to be some kind of religious war now in the Middle East, the basis of it is oil, is materialism. So I think we cannot ignore that when it comes to violence. So the question for an ethical person to address is, okay, we can talk about religion and so forth, but ultimately, what is the culture of that society? Most cultures now have become violently materialistic. They encourage you to look outside yourself for the good. The sense of good in you has gone. And to some extent, theism is also responsible for that, in positing goodness outside the human being. Not all kinds of theism, but some kinds are aggressively dualistic. So there is that culture, and that it does breed violence, I think. So the opposite of that is a culture where you value human beings, right? Whether it's theistic or non-theistic, where you say human beings have something good in them, right? So they do not need to find the good through buying things, through purchasing, through colonializing, through destroying the environment, destroying forests, right? So we're at a cross point, a very tricky situation because we're destroying the world and we're getting to the point where we won't be able to turn back. So it's a very urgent question, this one. And I don't think religion itself is going to be able to address it. It's really culture, and whether that culture is materialistic. And it's serious because we live in an age of mass culture. So the dominant culture dominates people's minds, from children's minds. They're already using, these things already. They're exposed to a certain culture, and that is the culture of materialism, that they will find happiness outside themselves. It's not even questioned anymore. There isn't even an opposition to it. It's taking over the world everywhere. That's the key battleground, I find. Can we destroy that culture? Can we show that it's a fallacy, right? If materialism worked, then it would destroy itself. So it doesn't work. There isn't a conspiracy theory behind it. It's not something someone invented, but it's some kind of evil that's come about. And I think we all have to wake up and say, no, human beings have goodness in themselves. What they're looking for outside of themselves is actually in them, right? And that's not going to make anyone richer. You won't be able to sell. There will be an economic crisis. But we will save humanity. So I think we really have to look at that. It's very important. Thank you for bringing that.
I think, just to kind of clarify my kind of discourse on labels. Of course, everything's labelled. This is paper, that's a glass, a cup, plastic cup of water. Yeah, of course, labels are names of things, of course. I was really referring to political identity, where you're saying that because someone has a particular attribute of themselves, they now form a separate political community within society and must be dealt with or engaged with and understood separately from the rest of society just because they have one particular attribute. And that was really what I was criticizing. And I want to juxtapose that with not just the use by Abrahamic religions of labels, but the wisdom of the ancients in this matter. Where you found people were labelled in the ancient world as well as in Abrahamic faiths. They were labelled according to their beliefs, their practices, and their culture. So if this person is from Athens, there's an Athenian, the person from Sparta would know what an Athenian is like, and it would help that person from Sparta to know how to deal with an Athenian because you know their culture, and so it helps you to engage. The first thing you ask anyone you meet is where you're from. Where are you from? Because it helps to give you a frame of reference so you know how to engage with them. Because if you know their culture, then you know how to address something or say it in a certain way that they'll understand or something. So this is where labels are good, where labels are needed and are natural. But these are not causes of political identities or separate political identities by which, or different interest groups within society. And that's where I would criticize. Where I think Abrahamic faiths have got it right with regards to labels is because by labeling, or rather considering different communities based on what they believe and practice, it's more accurate. For example, just consider, what do you think is more defining of you as a person? The eye color, your skin color, your sexual preference, or the values that you believe in, your ideas, your beliefs, your culture, your practices? What do you think really defines you most? It's not going to be the superficialities of skin color or eye color. It's going to be what you believe, what defines your character. That's what defines you more than anything else. So faith has it kind of hit the nail on the head by defining people according to, or labeling people according to how they choose to define themselves. And that is, I think, a more enlightened way, and it's the wisdom of the ancients, it's the wisdom of the Abrahamic religions. As for the problems that people concerning about the other, I've often found, that's my criticism of postmodernism, the problem is not othering people, it's what you think of the other. The problem is not having an other, it's just what you think of the other. And what I would say about in that regard is and I'll speak for Islam specifically in this particular point, I'll let the other Abrahamic religions speak for themselves, is that while people might be labeled as Muslim or not a Muslim based on what they publicly profess to believe in, it doesn't mean that you've somehow judged the hereafter of that person or the destination of that person. In the Quran and in many of the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, we hear so many narrations of a person who said they were Muslim in this life. On the Day of Judgment, they were an insincere person, unjust, oppressive, very nasty individual, and they will be not saved. And then there'll be people on the Day of Judgment who during this life never labeled themselves as a Muslim, but were sincere to whatever truth they knew. They tried to seek the truth. They tried to be just and noble, and they will be saved. So labeling in the sense of the Islamic perspective doesn't mean that you know what the person's hereafter, and nor should you judge it, because only God can judge that. And judge not lest you'll be judged and you be on the hereafter discover that you're the one that wasn't saved, and the person that you demonized actually is the person who is saved because they were more sincere and just to the truth than you were. And I believe, if I might be so bold, that in Christianity there's a similar concept of, I think in the New Testament, where a man will come to Jesus on the Day of Judgment and say, Lord, Lord, I did miracles in your name. Literally did miracles, wow. In their name, and Jesus said, I know you not. I don't know you. Right? So that person might be insincere, did it for a bad reason. So I don't think there's a problem with faith labeling people based on whether you believe in an idea or treating them in a manner of which, considering that they believe in certain beliefs, so obviously, Muslims wouldn't expect Christians to, let's say, abstain from pork because Christians don't believe it's prohibited, so it'd be unfair. And if I know that, I wouldn't have that expectation, of course. But also, to kind of answer some of the other points which, very briefly, of which Dibesh mentioned, it is true that in many parts of the world there is antipathy to the label called gay people or homosexual people. That is true, and the word homosexual is used and the word gay is used, and it's used in a very pejorative term, and it's used to demonize and discriminate. That does exist in the world today. It's not denied, it can't be denied. But the origin of this isn't religion. You'll find that, I don't want to always blame everything on imperialism or colonialism. But
please go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
That we can agree on that.
Okay.
We can go ahead.
You'll find that what suffused the Middle East, Muslim world, and I think it was one particular recent case of Kenya, which became in the news quite recently to do with its treatment of people who have same-sex attraction. The values that the British exported to the world, Victorian British ideals, including this sexual taxonomy and this discrimination, people in Kenya didn't have a word for a person who's homosexual. They suddenly learned the word, learned to hate it, and then the rest was history. Same in the Middle East. Many Muslims were taught this word, came from the British. British was seen to be a superior civilization. They took it hook, line, and sinker, incorporated into their own theological discussions, and then they said, yes, homosexuality. Then they start to say homosexuality is X, Y, and Z, even though the word homosexual and homosexuality does not exist in the Quran, doesn't exist in the narrations of Prophet Muhammad, doesn't exist in the Bible, or in the Tanakh, or even in ancient Greece. It was an invented word, and that's what I object to, and that's why I object to discriminatory labels of that nature, because that's how discrimination began. And I think just to finish off, what you mentioned about who formed the kind of ideas or interpretations of religion at the outset, I'm not going to speak for the other Abrahamic religions. In this particular case, I'll just speak for Islam. But Islam doesn't have a clergy. We don't have a clerical caste. What we do have is we have people who study and become scholars and can speak authoritatively about Islam, about jurisprudence, and of which we've had many female jurisprudence and scholars. There's a great book you should find if you can Google it. If you ask me how it's spelled, it's called Muhaddithat, and in Arabic it means the female collectors of the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this Akram Nadawi went around to compile all the names of prominent women who basically were Muslim scholars, Islamic scholars, during the first 3 generations of Islam. He got to 6,000 names. He stopped at that, not because there was no more, but because he just gave up. There's too many, and he had to publish the book. So we had a lot of female interaction and formation of our jurisprudence. But I would hasten to add that should be irrelevant. The sex or gender of the person is irrelevant to the operation of their intellect. And what was important wasn't that there's females or males, but that there were people of intellect dealing with Islamic jurisprudence. And that's really all Islam cares about in this sense. Is we're meritocratic in that sense. We don't care about the gender. It's irrelevant who's the sexual organs attached to the intellect that is going through our jurisprudence and giving us advice. So that would be my point. I think the last point you mentioned about violence, which is a very big topic, and can of worms. All I will say is this: is the Oklahoma bomber Timothy McVeigh, he justified his bombing by reference to the U.S. Constitution. So, while Americans know that his interpretation of the U.S. Constitution would not stand in any American court of law and is absurd, but he tried to defend himself by reference to the U.S. Constitution, which he believed gave him the authority to go against the American government, which he believed had overstepped its bounds. And for many far right who point to the US Constitution to say that they are allowed to hate immigrants and hate people who are non-American, or should I say non-European American, because they are a threat to the nation, and the Constitution gives them the right to defend the nation from threats, external and domestic. These are all interpretations that will be thrown out, thankfully, of American courts of law. Most Americans will think that's silly and absurd, and that's exactly what believers see. When people say, is this violence due to some interpretation of religion? Well, that's no different to Timothy McVeigh. For us, that's why we should never connect religion to violence. The violence is connected to the individual that undertakes it.
Thanks. How many? We have got one question there, 2, 3. Well, that's the last. Fine, we'll take 3 questions together and then final words from all of you. And we have only 7 minutes for that in total. So please.
Thanks for your talks. I'll keep it very brief.
Yes.
3 very short questions.
And they'll have to keep it brief. Abdullah, you can also. Sure.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It was really interesting. When you mentioned postmodernism, the tradition of liberal secularism, and communism, what hypothesis, debates, theorists, people are we talking about here? That's number 1. Number 2 is, what relationship do you see between individualism and larger macro structures in society, ranging from basically the whole tradition of modernity all the way to capitalism and contemporary technoscience? Lastly, what is your conception of the law? How does this relate to psychical reality and the act and desire on the other hand?
Okay, thank you. Second, 2 minutes.
7 hours later.
My question relates to limitations on sex in society. It's always been that religion imposes the sexual limitations, but if we're talking about a society where religion is kicked out, similar to our society now, where do the limitations come from, and what's the criteria? For example, we're talking about incestual relationships. It's always been that homosexuality has been pushed onto us because people can fall in love, they're sexual mature, they're mature enough to have sex as well as consenting to one another. So where are the limitations, and why are those limitations applied to a non-theistic society?
Where would the limitation come from in a society where religion is
why would you impose
there? Okay. Fine. And third, yes, please.
My question is to everybody, really, whether we've got time or not. It's to do with the relationship between love and sex that people seem to be quite messily interchanging, and this is a very pertinent question. I think the most important question, I don't think has been covered at all, and I don't think the mechanisms of desire have been spoken about, and how the law functions and how desire functions, and why desire and sex and love are completely different things, and they operate on completely different frameworks, and they need to be understood as such, because we can't possibly talk about love and sex in the same breath like they mean the same thing, because they don't.
Thank you.
For certain societies.
Yes. So now, can we take a couple of minutes each and then answer what, if you have, want to start? Abdullah? But a couple of minutes, please. Okay. I know there was a bigger question for you, and you can't answer all of them if you can't, so that's fine. You can answer them after the session at 8:25.
Yeah, I mean, who defines postmodernism and communism and even liberalism are massive questions. I'll just say that, as the funny saying goes, with regards to liberalism, I think liberal academics can't agree on anything but the name. So it's hard to define, but I'm using how it's been interpreted popularly in society and implemented as such, the general consensus, which might not reflect the academic consensus, if there is one. These are big questions about communism and postmodernism. Maybe afterwards we can discuss it. So I apologize for that. But I'll talk about what you said, act and desire, which is quite interesting discussion. I only touched upon it in my opening presentation, and I suppose there's been debates as to what considers to be consent and giving consent to sexual intercourse in society, which I think is a fascinating question, because, for example, there's laws that if someone can be too drunk to give consent, there's cases where a person was drunk and tried to actively seek out someone for sex, and that person kept pushing them back, pushing away, but then relented, and the person who relented actually was prosecuted for rape because the person who was too drunk to consent, even though that person was the aggressive one. You understand? And of course, how do you then measure what is being too drunk to consent, as well as if you lie to seduce somebody, and they've made a choice based on inaccurate information, is that also without consent? Is that could you say there's no consent or not? And all these complications in the law, which are now currently being debated in many different countries, have really complicated matters. If I might be cheeky, I might say, if you didn't have any alcohol, you could get rid of all these complications, which at least I know Islam prohibits, makes things much more easier. People are easy to know who's culpable and who's not.
Well, men have been raping women for thousands of years without alcohol. They don't need alcohol to rape women. That's the main cause of sexual violence, is men raping women. So it's like pointless to start talking about legislation and law.
We're not talking about who initiates it. We're talking about establishing culpability in court, and it's much more easier to establish culpability in court if no one's drunk or no one can claim they were drunk in the first place, and there's no alcohol in the first place. That was my point. As to, I find that unfortunately humans have been raping humans for centuries, killing humans and committing theft. Well,
okay, that's fine.
Okay. So basically, individualism as a model to judge whether consent is given, or how social relations has many flaws and problems within it, because it's hard to make these particular judgments, and there are things which are prohibited, which how could you justify them being so, such as incest if done with protection, or bigamy, which is obviously is illegal in this country. For example, if it's done with consent, why is it banned? Obviously, drugs is a big issue. If people want to do drugs and they're only imbibing it themselves, then why are you going to prosecute them? Aren't they adults to make that choice? So these are the issues which I tried to raise up. But there was one interesting point I would like to raise for discussion about this matter, which is sexual harassment. And there are laws in this country against sexual harassment, and the laws actually specifically say that creating a sexually offensive environment is prohibited. And in the law's formulation, it doesn't even require it to be intended. So even if it's not intended, the person could still be prosecuted for creating a sexually offensive environment. I found that interesting, considering that you have obviously there's a permission society for people to wear sexually provocative clothing, all genders, in public. And how does that figure in? How does that actually make sense? In this particular case, I would say that maybe Abrahamic religions have something to offer in this manner, a solution. I know you mentioned materialism requires a solution to the problems it's caused. You said it won't be provided by religion. I'd argue that it can only be provided by religion, because materialism is, by definition, devoid of at least spiritual religion. Whereas you need to have a religion to say, you know what, maybe men and women shouldn't be sexually objectified, maybe there should be public modesty, and there shouldn't be a sexually offensive environment created which demeans both men and women and is exploited by the businesses to sell products in the first place, which only perpetuates the vicious cycle. So maybe that's something that Abrahamic religion can contribute to solve some of the problems that have been raised by many inside today.
Well, apart from the fact that Max Weber is the one that suggests that Protestantism is an early form of capitalism and kind of generates this materialism. So maybe some Abrahamic.
We'll come to you.
Maybe. Sorry, not Protestantism.
Especially, I want someone to respond to his question also, that if religion is out of the society, then where would moral limitations come from?
I would object to a couple of things. The idea that religion is out of the society. I think there's a thing called the myth of secularization. Yes, we are a secular society in that religion doesn't have as much influence on our laws or state as it might have done before. However, people are increasingly turning to religious beliefs of different kinds. If you look at the rise in things like, the obsession with Game of Thrones. I love Game of Thrones, but what is that? That is a mystical, religious, sexual, weird thing that people, I think, are hungry for. I think also the thing I'd object to is this idea that religion is, my religion is not actually a set of rules designed to make people behave in a certain way, and therefore, without being a Christian, I would not be able to be a moral person. I think that Jesus in the New Testament says that there are only two laws that matter. One is love God and love your neighbour. And actually, if our laws were built around loving our neighbour, that might protect us, might encourage flourishing in our society, and might be the thing that could drive us.
I would just completely agree with that. Apart from the fact that you raised a good question in that where does normativity come from if it's no longer going to come from religion? And I think that we need to recognise that the secular and the religious are far more entwined than the narrative of secularization would suggest. That actually, and even people like Jürgen Habermas are arguing that modernity has failed to deliver on its promise and actually needs to turn to religious ideas, albeit ones that have to be translated into a secular idiom in order to perhaps attune populations to the values of equality, liberty, fraternity, and so on. So I just think that the relationship between religion and the secular have never been separate. They're actually continuations of each other, and it's mistaken to think that somehow religious values are not actually foundational to the law of most liberal democracies, at least.
Okay, I'll take a couple of minutes for reflection and then pass it on to David. Of course, it's not meant as...
It was a really good question.
Yes, but thank you to all of you for question. Of course, when I had asked initial question, I didn't mean that, I'm somehow associating religion with violence and somehow saying that religious violence or, that's uniquely violent. I was raising the question that when we had a discussion, I understand the wider context of so-called war on terror, wider context of a lot of skepticism and particular targeting and Islamophobic targeting of people, that we have to be careful when we talk of these things. But for me, initial anxiety was connected to the complete silence about violence. So it's not about that focusing on religion, focusing on violence, but about why completely ignoring it, right? But that's it. And in terms of labeling, of course, the reason we agree to sort of coordinate is because we are dealing with politics in any case, right? So it's about discussions, it's about challenging ideas, it's about rethinking ideas, and of course we'll have our own disagreements with each other, including, let's say, not violent disagreements, but almost total disagreements. The purpose of these kind of events are we raise more questions than we answer, right? And that's, I think, for that I would pass it on to David, but thank him for organizing this, including even inviting me to chair this, him knowing that how strong I have my views are on certain subjects and how I have to keep my views mostly sort of under control. Anyway, please.